American presidents are handpicked and financed by these special interest power groups. Like George W. Bush, John Forbes Kerry, whose initials are JFK, is a member of Yale University's Skull and Bones Brotherhood. The Forbes part of John Kerry's name identifies his descendancy from Captain Robert Bennett Forbes, who was a drug runner for the Rothschilds' opium drug trade with China in the 1800s. Most U.S. citizens believe that the United States is a country and that the president is the most powerful man on earth. The United States is not a country. It is a corporation, and the president is president of the corporation of the United States. He and his elected officials work for the corporation, not for the American people. Since the United States is a corporation, who owns the corporation of the United States? Like Canada and Australia, whose leaders are prime ministers of the Queen, and whose land is called Crown Land, the United States is just another crown colony. Crown colonies are controlled by the empire of 3 city-states. At the center of each city-state is a towering, phallic-shaped stone monument called an obelisk that points skyward. In D.C.'s city-state, the obelisk, known as the Washington Monument, was dedicated to Freemason George Washington by the Freemason Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia. The secretive Brotherhood of Freemasons laid the Washington obelisk's cornerstone in 1848 and contributed 22 Masonic memorial stones. 250 Masonic lodges financed the Washington Monument obelisk, including the Knights Templar Masonic Order. At the heart of London city-state is a 187-ton, 69-foot-tall Egyptian obelisk called Cleopatra's Needle. It was transported from Egypt and erected on the banks of the River Thames. In Vatican City, another Egyptian obelisk towers high above St. Peter's Square. What exactly is an obelisk? Obelisks are phallic-shaped monuments honoring the pagan sun god of ancient Egypt called Amun-Ra. The spirit of this pagan god is said to reside within the obelisk. Obelisks symbolize the phallus and fertility. At the base of the obelisk is a sunwheel circle symbolizing the vagina. Together, they depict male and female sexual union. Worshippers of Amun believe Amun is the supreme god and creator of all things, and can transform himself into other gods, like Osiris, the god of the underworld, or Seth, the god of evil and chaos. Since vowels were interchangeable in the biblical Hebrew language, Amun can be spelled A-M-E-N, A-M-O-N, O-M-O-N, or A-M-U-N. Today, Amun is one of the most popularly used words in the entire world. It is used in all languages by Christians, Muslims, Hindus, and Jews at the end of prayer. Without realizing it, people all over the world are praising Amun. The Old Testament of the Bible is the holy book of both Christians and Jews. Amun is repeated over and over again throughout the Bible and is hidden within the word testament. The word Amun literally means the hidden one. Many are fooled into believing that Amun means so be it or truly, but in Kings 1 verse 36 of the Old Testament, Amun is identified as the Lord God of my Lord. Why in the world would the Vatican, a fortress of Puritan Christian values, erect a monument symbolizing the pagan god Amun and sexual intercourse right in its own front yard? Bloodshed between the Israeli Jews and the Palestinian Muslims is routinely reported by the Western news media. But how much does the general public really know about what's going on in Israel? And why should they even care? Why? Because Israel has written human history, and it is also writing the future of humanity. It is important to know that the land now called Israel was originally called Canaan in ancient times. Canaan was populated by the Canaanite people, who were the ancestors of today's Palestinians imprisoned in refugee camps in Israel. About 3,500 years ago, the Semitic Hyksos kings ruled Egypt for 100 years, but were expelled from Egypt into Canaan. The Egyptians called these Hyksos people the Habarus, which means Hebrews. These expelled Hebrews invaded and conquered the land of Canaan and changed the name of the land from Canaan to Israel. In 135 AD, the name was once again changed to Palestine after the Romans conquered the land. As recently as 1948, the name was officially changed back to Israel again by the Hebrew Zionists, who slaughtered and drove the Palestinian people from their homes, land, and villages after World War II. The best way to understand what's really going on in the world today is to journey back in time and dig up the ancient secrets of the past. Those ancient secrets have been hidden by the ruling class beneath the shifting sands of Egypt for more than 4,000 years. Historian travel guides like Josephus, Herodotus, and Manetho, as well as writers like David Rohl, Ralph Ellis, and Niels Peter Lemke, provide flashlights into the past. The earliest remains of human life on Earth were discovered in Africa. The ancient Egyptians kept detailed records of their culture and history in tombs, in temples, and on pottery, using pictures and writings called hieroglyphics. Archaeology experts have found absolutely no evidence whatsoever that Hebrew Jews lived as slaves in Egypt or of their exodus from Egypt. The plain truth is that Moses didn't lead Hebrew slaves out of Egypt any more than Charlton Heston did. So who was that bearded man with a magical staff named Moses? There is not one shred of archaeological evidence for the existence of Moses or of any of the Bible's main cast of Hebrew characters, from Abraham to Jacob to Joseph to King David to King Solomon. There is, however, plenty of evidence for the existence of Egyptian pharaohs who these biblical characters are based on. The Bible's Old Testament has carefully covered up the connection between the Egyptian pharaohs and the Hebrew patriarchs by mixing up historical facts with myths and legends. The job of archaeology experts and historians is to separate fact from fiction. Modern archaeologists have confirmed that the Hebrews were not a race of people as once thought. They were a Semitic and Asiatic class of foreign workers who migrated into Egypt from neighboring lands in search of work as craftsmen and builders. As their population multiplied over hundreds of years, they contributed to Egyptian technology, worshipped Egyptian gods, intermarried with Egyptian nobility, and gradually rose to positions of power and wealth in Egypt. The Bible story of the Hebrew Jews begins with Abram, who was born north of Canaan in the town of Ur around 2055 BC. Abram married his beautiful sister Sarai. At God's command, the incestuous couple changed their names to the Egyptian names of Abraham and Sarah and migrated to Egypt. Once in Egypt, Abraham turned his sister wife Sarah over to the Pharaoh as his harem sex slave and was rewarded with gold and silver. Abraham received covenants or promises from God. God promised to make his name great and to make a great nation for him. God also made a circumcision covenant with Abraham, commanding him to mark the flesh of his people and slaves by cutting off the protective foreskin of their penises. Circumcision was a painful barbaric custom that was introduced into Egypt near this same time and has survived to this day. It is the unnecessary mutilation of the genitals of little boys and implies that God made a mistake in design. This mutilation custom has more to do with a mark of Hebrew ownership than with hygiene. In the continuing Bible story, Abraham married an Egyptian woman named Hagar because his sister wife Sarah couldn't conceive, but at age 90, Sarah finally gave birth to a son named Isaac. Following God's order to sacrifice his son, Abraham hog-tied Isaac and picked up a knife to kill him. Just as Abraham was about to plunge the knife into Isaac, he learned God was only kidding. Who was the ruling pharaoh that the Bible neglects to identify when Abraham and Sarah reached Egypt? His name was Amenemhet I, and he ruled Egypt from 1991 BC to 1962 BC. The name Amenemhet means Amen is the head. Besides Pharaoh Amenemhet and biblical Abraham living in the same place at the same time, is there any other evidence connecting biblical Abraham to Pharaoh Amenemhet I? According to Egyptian history, Pharaoh Amenemhet I was not of royal blood, and his family origin is unknown. Egyptology experts believe he seized the throne of Egypt after murdering Pharaoh Mentuhotep. In 1818, Antonio Lobolo made a revolutionary discovery that identified the biblical Abraham as an Egyptian pharaoh. During Lobolo's excavations in the Egyptian Valley of the Kings, he exhumed 11 Egyptian mummies along with rolls of papyri inscribed with hieroglyphic writings and drawings. One of those drawings was interpreted by Mormon Joseph Smith and his Egyptologists as Abraham sitting on the pharaoh's throne. Abraham's name was also deciphered on a roll of papyrus. Joseph Smith published his controversial findings in the Book of Abraham in 1842 and was murdered 2 years later. Today, the only Egyptian pyramid tomb forbidden to the public is the tomb of Pharaoh Amenemhet I, who many researchers now believe is the biblical Abraham. Why have Egyptologists never found the remains of Pharaoh Amenemhet I or of biblical Abraham? The best explanation is that their common remains are concealed inside the famous Ark of the Covenant. The Hollywood movie Raiders of the Lost Ark was about the search for the lost Ark of the Covenant. According to the Bible story, the tablets of the 10 Commandments given to Moses by God were stored inside the Ark. Egyptian artifacts tell the true story about what's really inside the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant is, in fact, an Egyptian canopic chest, where the dried organs of royal kings and pharaohs were stored, not the 10 Commandments. Why did the Hebrews call their royal canopic chest the Ark of the Covenant? Because the name signifies the covenants or promises that God made with Abraham. Would the Hebrews carry the Ark of the Covenant into battle to kill and steal if it really contained commandments like, "Thou shalt not kill or steal"? The best explanation is that the Ark contained the remains of their ancestral leader who led them into battle. Biblical Hebrew rulers like King Solomon broke all of the commandments, just like today's rulers who make and break laws and commandments to exploit the obedient masses. The evidence shows that the ancestral patriarch of the Hebrew Jews is Amenemhet I, and that his biblical name is Abraham. Since Pharaoh Amenemhet worshipped the god Amun, are Amun and the biblical God the same God? Michelangelo's Vatican painting of God depicts God as an angry, bearded white man. God's words, actions, and deeds in the Bible's Old Testament show God's extreme favoritism for the Hebrews generally and for Hebrew males in particular. By today's standards, that behavior is considered both racist and sexist. God admits to being a jealous God who approves of ritual human and animal sacrifice as proof that he is obeyed and worshipped above all other gods. He terrorizes, punishes, and kills the enemies of the Hebrews. He uses his godly power to kill Egyptian children and spread plagues, famines, pestilence, and darkness. He magically turns staffs into deadly venomous snakes and turns the Nile River into blood. Like the biblical God, the god Amun-Ra also turns the Nile River into blood in the Egyptian myth of Hathor. The Bible God's opinion of humanity is that all human beings are sinful children who are all born into sin. Since his words and deeds describe an angry, violent, and jealous God, are the biblical God and the ancient Egyptian god Amun, whose name is repeated over and over in the Bible, one and the same God? What is an Egyptian pyramid and the eye of the Egyptian god Horus doing on the American $1 bill? Why have Washington, London, and the Vatican erected towering obelisk monuments honoring the pagan Egyptian god Amun-Ra? In the next Bible episode, Abraham's son Isaac, who Abraham almost stabbed to death, grows up to father twin boys named Jacob and Esau. A murderous rivalry develops between the twins, and Jacob flees to a place known today as Bethel in Israel. He lays his head down to rest on a large, smooth stone and dreams of a stairway reaching to heaven like a ladder. The stairway in Jacob's dream describes the step pyramids built by Egyptian pharaohs like ladders reaching to heaven. The symbolic stone where the Hebrew Jacob laid his head thousands of years ago in Bethel is alternately called the Stone of Jacob, the Stone of Destiny, and the Stone of Scone. Today, the symbolic stone can be found underneath the British throne chair on top of the symbolic step pyramid where the Queen and other British monarchs have been crowned.
The battered oak coronation throne, on which every English monarch has been crowned, is built over the Stone of Scone.
As the Bible story continues, God promises Jacob that a nation and a company of nations shall come from him, and kings will spring from him. Jacob marries 2 of his girl cousins and fathers 12 sons. As Jacob ages, Joseph becomes his favorite son, and Dan becomes his venomous son. Jacob eventually takes his sons and his Hebrew clan and migrates from Canaan into Egypt. This Hebrew migration into Egypt closely parallels Egyptian history when the Semitic Hyksos migrants overthrew the Egyptian pharaohs and seized the throne of Egypt. One of the Semitic Hyksos leaders who became king of Egypt was Yacuber. Since Yacuber is the Aramaean name for Jacob, Egyptology experts interpret this as factual evidence that the biblical Jacob and the Hyksos king Yacuber were one and the same. Historical records show that the Semitic Hyksos kings ruled Egypt for over 100 years. The Egyptian people rebelled against these Semitic kings and pushed them into northern Egypt. By 1500 BC, a peace agreement was reached between the Egyptians and the Semitic Hyksos, which allowed the Hyksos people to leave Egypt peaceably and move to Palestine and Jerusalem in the Egyptian-controlled land of Canaan. Their gradual and peaceful migration closely matches the Bible story of the Semitic Hebrew exodus from Egypt into Canaan in 1447 BC. According to the Bible story, when the Hebrews arrived in Canaan, they renamed it Israel and divided the land up into 12 tribal states, which they named after the sons of Jacob. Jacob's favorite son Joseph stayed behind in Egypt. Joseph hid his Hebrew identity by marrying an Egyptian wife and changing his name to the Egyptian name Zaphanath-Paneah, which means he who can reveal secrets. According to the Bible, Joseph ruled Egypt as the Pharaoh's top vizier and bought up all the private land in Egypt from the starving people. Then he taxed them out of 1/5 of their income. Was Joseph the chief vizier of Pharaoh Moses, who negotiated the peace agreement allowing the Semitic Hebrew Hyksos people to settle in the Egyptian-controlled land of Canaan? The Hebrew connection to the Egyptian pharaohs is further revealed in the biblical story of Moses.
Many years ago, in a land called Egypt, there lived a very mean king. Egyptian kings were called pharaohs.
The story begins with the Egyptian pharaoh ordering the deaths of all Hebrew baby boys.
Oh no! They won't get my baby. I'll find some way to save him.
The Hebrew mother of baby Moses tries to save him by hiding him in the bulrushes on the Nile River.
What's that? A baby!
When baby Moses is found by the princess daughter of the Egyptian pharaoh, the princess decides to raise him as her own son. Moses now has two mothers, a royal Egyptian princess mother and a non-royal Hebrew mother who hides her identity as Moses' Hebrew mother, gets a job as a servant at the palace, and helps the princess raise Moses. Why did the Bible omit the historical names of the pharaoh's princess daughter and the pharaoh? Their historical identities can be found by comparing the dates and events of the Bible story with factual Egyptian history. All dates followed by the letters BC count backwards to 0, which is the beginning of today's Christian calendar. Bible researchers have calculated the birth of Moses at around 1520 BC. The ruling pharaoh of Egypt at that time was Thutmose I, and his princess daughter was Hatshepsut. Egyptian history verifies that Princess Hatshepsut married her brother named Pharaoh Thutmose II. But when Hatshepsut couldn't produce a male heir to the throne, her brother husband chose a non-royal mistress named Isis to produce a male heir and named their son Thutmose III. Hatshepsut raised the boy as her own son, even though Isis was his real birth mother. The Bible story of Moses closely matches the factual Egyptian story of Thutmose III. Even the names Moses and Thutmose are almost identical. In the Bible story, Moses gives up his big chance to be the richest, most powerful ruler in the ancient world to become a lowly, poverty-stricken Hebrew laborer. But wouldn't becoming ruler of Egypt and Canaan have been the most intelligent way to help his fellow Hebrews? The historical facts show that's exactly what Thutmose III did. Once he grew up to become Pharaoh of Egypt, Thutmose III organized military campaigns with his mighty armies and chariots and defeated the enemies of the Hebrew Hyksos who had settled in Canaan. After his famous Battle of Megiddo in Canaan in 1479 BC, Thutmose installed district governors in garrison cities throughout Canaan. Did Thutmose choose his district governors from the 12 Hebrew tribes named in the Bible? Is it just a coincidence that today's Temple of Isis, located on the Isle of Philae in Egypt, has the same name as Thutmose's mother? Some suggest that Thutmose III built the original Temple of Isis to honor his Hebrew mother, who was named after the goddess Isis, and that the temple was later restored by the Ptolemy kings. An inscription inside the temple identifies Isis as the mistress queen of Egypt. Today, Thutmose III is immortalized in stone in the corporate city-state of London, right next to his Egyptian obelisk honoring the pagan Egyptian god Amun. Why has UNESCO and others spent billions of dollars and years of labor moving the massive tonnage of the Isis temple and obelisks honoring the pagan god Amun? The answer lies within the continuing Bible story. After the Hebrews settled in the land of Canaan, they renamed it Israel. Their king, King David, reigned for 50 years. Egyptian history reveals that Pharaoh Susenes also ruled Canaan for nearly 50 years, at the same time as the biblical King David. Both battled the same enemy called the Sea People or Philistines. Both King David and Pharaoh Susenes had sons with almost identical names, Solomon and Simon. The name of biblical King David's son, Sol-Amon, means son for Saul, and O-M-O-N is an alternative spelling of Ammon. The name of Pharaoh Susenes' son, Si-Amon, means son of Ammon. Simon and Solomon reigned at exactly the same time and fought the same enemies in Canaan, called the Mitanni, the Hittites, and the Philistines. Pharaoh Simon's documented battle with the Philistines in Palestine and his capture of the Canaan city of Gezer clearly proves an ancient alliance between the Egyptians and the Hebrews. The famous King Solomon's temple in Jerusalem means Temple of the Sun God Ammon. According to the Talmud, King Solomon used the dark power of his magic ring to conjure up demons to help him build his temple. The temple became the center for sexual orgies, the worship of golden idols, and for animal and human sacrifices, including the sacrifice of infants and children. The biblical Ark of the Covenant was stored inside King Solomon's temple. The Ark had 4 gold rings built into its 4 corners, each representing the 4 corners of the earth over which descendants of the biblical Abraham are destined to rule. Since archaeologists claim the biblical King Solomon was no more real than the evil wizard Saruman from the movie Lord of the Rings, who built King Solomon's temple? The temple was most likely built by Pharaoh Solomon, who King Solomon's fabled character was based on. Today, all that remains of the temple is the Wailing Wall, where Israel's Jews still gather to worship in Jerusalem. Did the Hebrew authors of the Bible's Old Testament really expect readers to believe that Abraham lived to be 175? That his sister wife Sarah gave birth at age 90? That Moses turned staffs into snakes and rivers into blood? Why did the Hebrew authors of the Bible omit all of the important historical names of Egyptian pharaohs? Why did they mix up historical fact with myths and legends? The big question is, what did they have to hide? Researchers of both Bible and Egyptian history have concluded that the Hebrew authors of the Bible covered up the fact that the Hebrews and the Egyptians shared the same royal bloodline. But why? Why the cover-up? Because after the Egyptian people forced the Hebrew Hyksos kings out of Egypt, the only way the Hebrews could continue ruling Egypt was to hide their Hebrew identity from the Egyptian people. They did that by changing their Hebrew names to Egyptian names and intermarrying with Egyptian royalty, just like the biblical Joseph did. By hiding their Hebrew identity, the Hebrews continued to rule Egypt secretly as Egyptian royalty. They worshipped Egyptian gods, followed Egyptian laws, and violated Jewish Hebrew laws. This meant they had to hide their Hebrew identity not just from the Egyptian people, but from the Hebrew people as well. They had to keep their royal Hebrew Egyptian identity and their worship of Ammon hidden within royal power circles and secret societies, just as they have done to this day. The world's biggest and best-kept secret is that the descendants of the Hebrew pharaohs of Egypt have ruled throughout history. Over the millennia, they have left oceans of blood in their wake. They have murdered, cheated, slaughtered, robbed, colonized, and enslaved to fulfill their biblical covenants for an eternal throne and one world empire. Today, Queen Elizabeth II is the head of state of the great nation of the Hebrew Covenant called Great Britain. Her genealogy chart, according to the College of Heralds in London, traces her blue bloodline back to Abraham, who many modern scholars believe to be the Egyptian pharaoh, Amenemhet I. By connecting 22 dots, the true Hebrew and royal Egyptian identity of Queen Elizabeth II comes into focus. Number 1. What is the stone of Jacob, a Hebrew patriarch, doing beneath the Queen's throne chair? Number 2. Why was the Queen crowned at her coronation ceremony on top of a symbolic Egyptian step pyramid? Number 3. The monarch's crown has 12 stones at the base, each representing the 12 Hebrew tribes. The 12 stones of the 12 tribes were also worn on the breastplate of Hebrew high priests in Canaan. Number 4. The Union Jack represents the reunion of the United Kingdom of the 12 tribes of Jacob or Jack-Ub. The Union Jack is red, white, and blue, the same colors as the three crowns of Egypt. Number 5. The royal scepter originates in ancient Egypt and was carried by the Egyptian god Amun and by Egyptian pharaohs, who called themselves the Son of God. The royal scepter is now carried by pharaonic descendant Queen Elizabeth II. Her scepter contains the world's largest cut diamond, called the Star of Africa. Number 6. The Queen's punishing flail or whip is partially hidden under her arm. The flail or whip also originates with the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. Number 7. The symbol of the bee can be found within the Queen's royal wardrobe. In ancient Egypt, bees were the symbol of Egyptian royalty as well as the symbol of Egypt. Number 8. The symbols on the British coat of arms reveal Britain's Hebrew origin. According to the Bible, the harp symbolizes the Hebrew King David. The biblical lion and unicorn holding up the shield symbolize the nation of Israel. The motto, Dieu et mon droit, means God and my right, indicating the divine right of the British monarch to an eternal throne. Number 9. The headdress worn by judges and the Queen's high-ranking officials originate in ancient Egypt. Number 10. Kilts like the one worn by Prince Charles originate with the Egyptian pharaohs who wore white kilts. Number 11. The hymn, Zadok the Priest, written by Handel, was performed at the Queen's coronation in 1952. Zadok the Priest was the biblical priest who anointed the Hebrew King Solomon while the people cried, "God save King Solomon! Long live King Solomon! May the king live forever!"
God save Queen Elizabeth. Long live Queen Elizabeth. May the Queen live forever.
Number 12. During the coronation ceremony, the Queen turns to face the four corners of the globe. The orb carried by the Queen represents the globe over which the monarch rules. Number 13. The monarch's coronation gifts of a rod, bracelets, and a ring are a reenactment of the Bible story of the Hebrews, Judah, and Tamar. Number 14. Royal jubilees originate in ancient Egypt. Egyptian pharaohs celebrated their jubilees after 30 years of rule. In pharaonic tradition, the Queen has celebrated both silver and golden jubilees. Number 15. Incest was practiced by ancient Egyptian royalty. Mothers married sons and brothers married sisters to keep the power and the money all in the family. Like their pharaonic ancestors, the British monarchy have a long history of incestuous inbreeding. Number 16. The corpses of deceased pharaohs were preserved and entombed beneath their pyramid temples. The corpses of 19 deceased British monarchs are also preserved in marble tomb slabs beneath the modern-day temple called Westminster Abbey. Number 17. The ancient pharaohs advertised their power with their image on coins and stone monuments. The power of the Queen worldwide is advertised with her image printed on more coins and stamps than any other head of state in history. Number 18. The structure of government in ancient Egypt was a step pyramid model, with the Grand Vizier and priesthood one step below the pharaoh. Today's monarchy reigns using a much more sophisticated pyramid model of authority. Number 19. The Pope's headdress is strikingly similar to the headdress of the Egyptian god Amun. His bent cross resembles the scepter of Amun. Number 20. Like the Egyptian pharaohs, British monarchs wear signet rings, which over the millennia have been passed down from their Hebrew ancestors. Number 21. The British Mint recently printed legal tender coins called the One True Ring and the Ring of Power. On one side of the coin is Queen Elizabeth II. On the flip side is the ring from Lord of the Rings. These legal tender coins printed by the British Mint raise the disturbing question, who is the real Lord of the Rings?
One ring to rule them all.
The inscription on the ring reads, "One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness of their ignorance find them." Number 22. The covenant that the biblical God gave to Abraham was a promise to make his name great and to make for him a great nation. Today, Great Britain is the only nation called great. In Hebrew, the word Britain literally means land of the covenant, and British means man of the covenant. How on earth did the Hebrew throne of ancient Egypt and Canaan end up in Great Britain under Queen Elizabeth II?